Hello and welcome back, and today we want to do a very quick video comparing these two QNAP NAS devices. These are two systems that, whether you're a photo editor, a video editor, run your own post-production or bigger, you have probably been considering as an alternative to the cloud. Both Thunderbolt NAS devices. This is the TVS-872XT and this is the TVS-h874T. Two NASs released about 5 years apart, but still pretty much the go-to options when it comes to Thunderbolt equipped NAS devices. That is, NAS devices, like many others, that can be accessed over the internet or the local area network in a variety of different bandwidths, but also allow direct connectivity over Thunderbolt, point to point, for multiple editors to edit on this system, while other members of the team distribute the files, share the files, edit the files, do all of that stuff. And despite their 5-year difference, there'll be users that bought this device at launch and are thinking about upgrading, or there are users that looked at this device at launch and thought, that looks like a bit of a pretty penny, but that one's looking cheap these days. That's right now. Although the XT is harder to find, and although it used to be in 3 configurations and only 1 is available, more on that later on, I would still say that there are plenty of reasons why, despite this arriving on the scene very recently and having some serious hardware under the hood, this one has still got a lot going for it. Indeed, when I first reviewed this 5 years ago, I talked about just how fantastically future-proof that hardware was, and that has continued to be true. Before we go any further, let's talk about what they've got in common, because whether you are an existing owner or you're still on the fence about going for them, there's actually a lot of things that both of these systems provide. So really quickly, here's what you get whether you go for either of these. Number one, you will definitely get a system that runs either ZFS or ext4 as the file system. ZFS has a whole bunch of benefits in terms of performance, speed of hosting the storage, the removing of the volume layer there, as well as triple parity RAID and more. On top of that, things like inline data deduplication, which is when multiple files that are backed up that are the same on lots of devices, the system will only have to keep one copy of it and a record of where it's all from, as well as inline compression and compaction, which allows data to be shrunk in the process of being written to the device and take up less space. There's also caching benefits, write benefits, and the ability to create multiple storage tiers internally. Alongside that, loads of applications and services available from QNAP, from client apps for your Windows, Mac, Android, iOS system, all the way through to apps that run within inside these for multimedia, for multi-scale backups, off-site backups, virtual machine hosting, and more. On top of that, alongside all of that, both these systems arrive with Thunderbolt connectivity, network connectivity, Intel Core processors inside, DDR4 memory, scalability and upgradability for hard drives and SSDs, internally for M2 NVMe's and SATA 2.5-inch and 3.5-inch hard drives, supporting up to 22 TB at the time of recording, and even bigger coming very soon. And both of these arrive with warranty in terms of hardware from QNAP and a lifetime software warranty, lifetime being applied to the lifetime of the product, which is about 10 to 12 years. So plenty of in common between these two devices. But you didn't come here to hear about what they've got in common. You wanted to know what's different and hopefully help you decide which to go for. So I mentioned earlier on that the 872XT originally arrived in 3 configurations. There was an i3, an i5 and an i7 model. Now that Intel i7 processor, the Intel Core i7, was an 8th generation processor. Now there was an 8-core i7 processor and there was a 4-core i3 processor. What's left is the i5 6-core processor. Very decent power level, not too bad a TDP in terms of power consumption over time. On top of that, the system arrives with 16 gig of DDR4 memory. It doesn't support ECC because it is an Intel Core, not a Xeon processor. But that memory can be upgraded up to 64 gig internally, utilising SODIMM modules. It also arrives with 2 M.2 NVMe slots inside, and only if you've got the main storage array, which can be partially populated. But on top of that, you can install some faster SSDs internally, and the system's got 2 PCIe upgrade slots on the rear, a x16 and a x4 slot available to you there in terms of internal hardware. It's all lovely stuff. Now, the newer generation device very similar. I'm going to describe largely the same thing. It arrives this time with two different configurations internally in terms of hardware, arriving in an i7 or an i9 model. That i7 or i9 is a 12th generation, 4 generations later, Intel Core, arriving in either a 12-core processor or a 16-core processor, and that's power and efficiency core, something that Intel have worked on for a number of years to allow the cores to be more specialized to different tasks. Also, the integrated graphics is of a higher standard on this device. It arrives with either 32 or 64 gig of DDR4 memory. Again, no support of ECC, 64 gig is the max. And it's got those two M2 NVMe slots inside, and it's got two PCI upgrade slots, again, ×4 and ×16. So, very similar architecture between these two internally. However, that's just at a glance, and it's when you delve into it, and I'm sure it says it on the screen already, that you see how the bandwidth and the lanes afforded to these CPUs have changed the game. Because this is a Gen 3 system. It arrives with the two M2 NVMe slots at Gen 3 ×2 speed, which means those M2 NVMe slots allow 2000 megabytes per second bandwidth for each of those SSDs, and the PCIe slots are 3×4 and 3×16 speed. These, on the other hand, are Gen 4 slots. That means that the two M2 NVMe's, which by the way are Gen 4 ×4, so those two M2 NVMe's are afforded up to a maximum 8,000 megabytes per second or 8 gigabytes per second, which means utilizing Gen 4 SSDs, which are in the market right now up to 4 TB, will give you a substantial internal speed boost for your scratch disk or editing. But on top of that, the two M2 NVMe slots on the rear, being Gen 4 ×4 and Gen 4 ×16, afford 8 to 32 gig respectively, gigabytes of bandwidth, which can be utilized with 10G upgrade cards, 25 gig upgrade cards, 100 gig upgrade cards. You can even use some of their QM2 cards to add further 10G and combined M2 NVMe cards there. The QM2 Gen 4 series is out there now. And ultimately, all of that adds up to not only a much more powerful workhorse system that has developed over those 5 years between this being released, but also a similar long-term plan in terms of future-proofing. This is a system that is still going to be relevant in 5 years. This is going to be a system that I think is going to be relevant in about 7 to 10 years. It's that kind of hardware internally that it's running with. Now, this i5 model here is still very, very good, and if you don't think you're going to max that stuff out, if you're never going to use the scratch disk, if you're never going to go down the upgrade path route too hard, then it's a different story, because that base level hardware is still going to be doing you very, very well. And that same goes in terms of storage as well.
That still only counts as one!
So in terms of storage between these two devices, they are very, very similar. They've both got the 8 bays, as mentioned, which can be partially populated or fully populated. And thanks to improvements in the ZFS QUTS file system software from QNAP, what you can do is actually expand ZFS pools, something that even TrueNAS has only started to work on themselves for expanding a ZFS pool, something that in ext4 has always been possible. Also, both of these systems with the ext4 QTS platform allow you to use QTIA, which allows you to merge multiple different storage types into one large storage pool of hard drives and NVMe's together, and then intelligently moves the files, not copies them like caching, but moves wholesale the files onto the faster storage as required, or the slower storage, allowing you to create a hot, warm and cold storage box that all of your data lives inside. Now, they both support expansion devices. They both support the 2, the 4, the 8, the 12 and the 16 bay expansion devices from QNAP. You can attach up to 2 of each of those to the available USB ports. So again, lovely stuff. So is there really any advantage for going for the more expensive modern box in terms of storage expandability? Well, only in one way, and it's one that we've already touched on. It is the M2 NVMe support, and that is that this device, because it supports a higher bandwidth on those PCIe slots and a higher bandwidth on the M2 NVMe slots inside, it affords you faster access to that data. Now, the actual limits of capacity are no different, because 1, 2, 4 and 8 TB is available in Gen 3 SSDs as it is on Gen 4. But it's a faster access to that data that you may enjoy. And although it's a small advantage, it is an advantage in terms of storage ability between these two that is worth highlighting. Now, in terms of ports and connectivity, again, a lot of similarities between these two devices, but I will say this is one of the other areas that the 5 years of difference between the XT and the 74T series is really felt, not just in terms of Thunderbolt either. Now, the keen-eyed amongst you may have noticed that this is the 72X, not the XT. I don't have the XT here. That's because it is a much older device. But the X and the XT are very, very similar. You just have to trust me that this card up here would have 2 Thunderbolt ports on the XT series. You'd have 2 Thunderbolt 3 USB Type-C ports. You'd have 2 1 gig ports here. You'd have a 10 GBE port as well. You have an HDMI running at 4K, and you've got USB 3.2 Gen 2 10 gig ports on that older box there. Whereas in the case of the H874T, this system arrives with 2 Thunderbolt 4 ports, which, although improve a lot of the bandwidth management and power delivery and packet delivery over that of Thunderbolt 3, it has to be said that in terms of actual performance, Thunderbolt 3 and Thunderbolt 4 both provide the same 40 gigabits per second bandwidth. It is just a question of how much can be pushed through it by the host system. And although they both have 40 gigabits per second Thunderbolt ports, I would highlight that there is better hardware and storage support on this, remember that NVMe stuff and PCIe stuff from earlier, to ensure that this system will be able to take better advantage of the Thunderbolt connectivity despite having the same technical bandwidth between Thunderbolt 3 and Thunderbolt 4. Another thing, this system arrives with 2 2.5 gigabit Ethernet ports as standard, whereas this arrives with the 2 1 gig ports there. So that's the general standard of network connectivity of NAS that's changed in the last 5 years. So as good as that is to highlight on this, that is something we've come to expect across most, with the exception of Synology, NAS devices to arrive with 2.5 gig Ethernet rather than 1 gig as standard. But a number of you may have noticed something else. A complete lack of 10 gigabit Ethernet on that newer box. That is super annoying. Why is that? Because every other solution that QNAP have ever rolled out that has Thunderbolt on it, and they are pretty much the only brand, with a few outlier exceptions of single products, but they are the only brand out there rocking Thunderbolt NAS. Every one of their solutions except this one arrives with both Thunderbolt and 10 gigabit Ethernet. It's there because, one, you can allow the system to work as a Thunderbolt to Ethernet pass-through to allow your Mac device that only has Thunderbolt to not only edit on this device, but also through this access a greater 10 gig higher bandwidth network. But on top of that, it allows another connection between this device for editing, for distribution, for network connectivity, for the works, not just those 1 gigs. And yes, you can add more with those cards we mentioned earlier on, but it is the idea that this newer box, which is far newer, released 5 years later and costs more money, more on that later, doesn't have 10 gig out the door, really winds me up. I like there's those 2.5 gigs, fine, but as we already discussed, that's a general standard thing. This should have 10 gig out the gate, and the fact that it doesn't sort of winds me up. And although it still wins overall in terms of network hardware, in terms of, the ports and connections and bandwidth management, I will state that lack of 10 GBE is very damning to this, given the affordability of the rest of the architecture inside and the bandwidth available to it, and the fact that I think most users are going to slap a 10G in this, and it's the idea you're going to have to give up one of your PCIe slots. We're not at that stage yet of commercial viability and packaged product that we can use those 10G to M2 adapters that we're hearing more about at the end of 2023. But having to give up one of our ports here, one of our PCIe for a 10 gig card, is super annoying, especially when, because the Thunderbolt card maintains and is inside the Gen 4x4 slot, we'd have to put a 10G card in a x16 slot. What an absolute waste. That is even made even more exacerbated when you look at the product pages from QNAP. And again, look them out, they should be linked in the description. This system with a 25 gig card can crank out 2.5 to 3,000 megabytes per second on its base level hardware there. So you're not going to want to waste time putting a 10G card in here. You're either going to scale up to 25 gig, which means you have to upgrade your entire network environment, or you're going to have to accept that you're going to have to give up 10G or use this massively powerful slot for a 10G card. It's just annoying. But apart from that, I like it. I like the ports and connections and the bandwidth and what it can push through. I just don't understand why this 5 years older device that has Thunderbolt 3 still has 10G when the newer one doesn't. And finally, let's talk price. Normally by now, I would put the price or the value or the cost of these devices right at the beginning of the video. But for this specific video and the way we're talking about the hardware and the amount of money we're talking about as well, I thought it important to talk about what these systems are giving you before we talk about the price. Because we're talking about a 5 years old system versus a current system. Now, the XT is currently available at between $1,999 and about $2,300 or so. The price varies. Availability is nowhere near as strong as it used to be. There is still stock knocking around the world. It has seen a few revisions over time. Ultimately, it is still available, but it is very much at the tail end of its run. The TVS-h874T, of course, is quite new. Those two different versions are out there, and this rocks a price tag of $2,499 to a whopping $3,499, depending on where you shop around. That's a huge difference in price. Now, we haven't even discussed second-hand. We've not discussed buying this system used, because there'll be users that are upgraded, there are going to be users that have moved on to other things, gone on to larger server arrays, and of course, there are going to be users that were impacted by the backboard controller of this system. There were lots of reports we found out online a few years ago. Again, we've only really seen the culmination of that in the last few months as we've talked to more users, that the backboard on the Intel Core based 7.2 series, there were lots of users talking about how they had backboard failures, and QNAP was slowly but surely hitting all of those up. So that's another reason why you might see this second-hand quite a lot. And again, you can read a lot of reports about that online. I'm sure I'll link to some of them in the description below, or no doubt some have been recommended on the side by YouTube. Now, what that means is that does, for some users, make this a slightly troubling second-hand purchase, because you have to question why people are selling it second-hand, and therefore you're not covered by the hardware warranty. Whereas if you buy it new for a retailer, that hardware warranty available now is going to be available from now. So do keep that in mind, that although you might see this even lower price second-hand, really focus on this new if you're going to go for it, because you need to get it from a new retailer where that hardware warranty will still be active from the day of purchase. Now, that higher price point, $2,500 to $3,500 nicker, is a lot. You are getting a system that has significantly improved over the years, and I will say that when this launched with the i5 and the i7, its price tag was $2,500 at that point. It has gone down to that $2,000 mark, give or take. This will no doubt see price drops, and as time wears on, this will become a more affordable purchase. But I'll say right now at launch, we have to ask, is this worth that amount of money? And I think if you aren't prepared to take the time and build your own, if you aren't prepared to use an open source software and you want to use something more user friendly, you want software support, you basically are looking for stuff to do the fuss. You don't want to spend all your time learning about data storage and networking. You've already learnt for decades your craft of photo and video editing. You don't want to learn about network and storage. That money is worth it if that's what you're buying it for. You're looking for a solution where it is doing all of the hassle, it is doing all of the work, and you don't have to learn. There's still going to be a learning curve. But for that money, for a Thunderbolt solution, particularly in the case of that i7 or i9 12th gen 32 to 64 gig processor and all of that bandwidth afforded to it, I think that does make it better value. This is very good value for the price of what it is, as long as you buy it new with that warranty, because of those reports we've heard online. But other than that, in terms of between the two of them, if you're on the fence right now about buying a Thunderbolt NAS solution and you can't choose between them, I would recommend the newer one, because of one, the better hardware inside, better bandwidth afforded to it, and if you can get over that lack of 10 GBE, with the exception of that, I think most other regard, this is an absolute banger Thunderbolt system and a superior upgrade and refresh over that of the 72XT. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have or you need further support, there are lots of ways in which myself and Eddie at NAS Compares, is just us here, can help you. Number one, the free advice section on the right hand side of every single page over on NAS Compares. Number two, there's our Discord. Number three, there's our free community forum, ask.nascompares. Then you can get expedited support by going via Ko-Fi or Coffee and Patreon, where you can get expedited support. You can hire me over there for Zoom consultations, as well as joining our membership program, where you can get expedited support every single month, as well as access to a lot of these videos and tutorials early, content support, and our monthly seminars and Zooms. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.